"You see now how the case stands, do you not?" he continued. "After a youth and manhood past, half in unutterable misery and half in dreary solitude, I have for the first time found what I can truly love. I have found you. You are my sympathy, my better self, my good angel. I am bound to you with a strong attachment. I think you good, gifted, lovely. A fervent, a solemn passion is conceived in my heart. It leans to you, it draws you to my center and spring of life, wraps my existence about you, and kindling in pure, powerful flame, fuses you and me in one. It was because I felt and knew this that I resolved to marry you. To tell me that I had already a wife is empty mockery. You know now that I had but a hideous demon. I was wrong to attempt to deceive you, but I feared a stubbornness that exists in your character. I feared early instilled prejudice. I wanted to have you safe before hazarding confidences. This was cowardly. I should have appealed to your nobleness and magnanimity at first, as I do now, opened to you plainly my life of agony, described to you my hunger and thirst after a higher and worthier existence, shown to you not my resolution, that word is weak, but my resistless bent to love faithfully and well where I am faithfully and well loved in return. Then I should have asked you to accept my pledge of fidelity and to give me yours. Jane, give it me now." A pause. "Why are you silent, Jane?" I was experiencing an ordeal. A hand of fiery iron grasped my vitals. Terrible moment, full of struggle, blackness burning. Not a human being that ever lived could wish to be better loved than I was loved. And him who thus loved me I absolutely worshipped, and I must renounce love and idol. One drear word comprised my intolerable duty: depart. "Jane, you understand what I want of you, just this promise. I will be yours, Mr. Rochester." "Mr. Rochester, I will not be yours." Another long silence. "Jane," recommenced he with a gentleness that broke me down with grief and turned me stone cold with ominous terror. For this still voice was the pant of a lion rising. "Jane, do you mean to go one way in the world and to let me go another?" "I do." "Jane," bending towards and embracing me, "do you mean it now?" "I do." "And now?" softly kissing my forehead and cheek. "I do," extricating myself from restraint rapidly and completely. "Oh, Jane, this is bitter, this is wicked. It would not be wicked to love me. It would to obey you." A wild look raised his brows, crossed his features. He rose, but he forbore yet. I laid my hand on the back of a chair for support. I shook, I feared, but I resolved. "One instant, Jane. Give one glance to my horrible life when you are gone. All happiness will be torn away with you. What then is left? For a wife I have but the maniac upstairs. As well might you refer me to some corpse in yonder churchyard. What shall I do, Jane? Where turn for a companion and for some hope?" "Do as I do. Trust in God and yourself. Believe in heaven. Hope to meet again there." "Then you will not yield?" "No." "Then you condemn me to live wretched and to die accursed?" His voice rose. "I advise you to live sinless, and I wish you to die tranquil." "Then you snatch love and innocence from me. You fling me back on lust for a passion, vice for an occupation." "Mr. Rochester, I no more assign this fate to you than I grasp at it for myself. We were born to strive and endure, you as well as I. Do so. You will forget me before I forget you. You make me a liar by such language. You sully my honor. I declared I could not change. You tell me to my face I shall change soon. And what a distortion in your judgment, what a perversity in your ideas is proved by your conduct. Is it better to drive a fellow creature to despair than to transgress a mere human law, no man being injured by the breach? For you have neither relatives nor acquaintances whom you need fear to offend by living with me." This was true, and while he spoke, my very conscience and reason turned traitors against me and charged me with crime in resisting him. They spoke almost as loud as feeling, and that clamored wildly. "Oh, comply," it said. "Think of his misery, think of his danger, look at his state when left alone. Remember his headlong nature. Consider the recklessness following on despair. Soothe him, save him, love him, tell him you love him and will be his. Who in the world cares for you? Or who will be injured by what you do? Still indomitable was the reply. I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, inviolate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I have always believed. And if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. Preconceived opinions, foregone determinations are all I have at this hour to stand by. There I plant my foot. I did. Mr. Rochester, reading my countenance, saw I had done so. His fury was wrought to the highest. He must yield to it for a moment, whatever followed. He crossed the floor and seized my arm and grasped my waist. He seemed to devour me with his flaming glance. Physically, I felt at the moment powerless as stubble exposed to the draught and glow of a furnace. Mentally, I still possessed my soul, and with it the certainty of ultimate safety. The soul, fortunately, has an interpreter, often an unconscious but still a truthful interpreter in the eye. My eye rose to his, and while I looked in his fierce face, I gave an involuntary sigh. His grip was painful, and my overtaxed strength almost exhausted. "Never," said he as he ground his teeth. "Never was anything at once so frail and so indomitable. A mere reed she feels in my hand," and he shook me with the force of his hold. "I could bend her with my finger and thumb, and what good would it do if I bent, if I uptore, if I crushed her? Consider that eye, consider the resolute, wild, free thing looking out of it, defying me with more than courage, with a stern triumph. Whatever I do with its cage, I cannot get at it. The savage, beautiful creature. If I tear, if I rend the slight prison, my outrage will only let the captive loose. Conqueror I might be of the house, but the inmate would escape to heaven before I could call myself possessor of its clay dwelling place. And it is you, spirit, with will and energy and virtue and purity that I want, not alone your brittle frame. Of yourself you could come with soft flight and nestle against my heart. If you would, seized against your will, you will elude the grasp like an essence. You will vanish ere I inhale your fragrance. Oh, come, Jane, come." As he said this, he released me from his clutch and only looked at me. The look was far worse to resist than the frantic strain. Only an idiot, however, would have succumbed now. I had dared and baffled his fury. I must elude his sorrow. I retired to the door. "You are going, Jane?" "I am going, sir." "You are leaving me?" "Yes." "You will not come, you will not be my comforter, my rescuer, my deep love, my wild woe, my frantic prayer are all nothing to you?" What unutterable pathos was in his voice. How hard it was to reiterate firmly, "I am going." "Jane!" "Mr. Rochester." "Withdraw then. I consent, but remember you leave me here in anguish. Go up to your own room. Think over all I have said, and Jane, cast a glance on my sufferings. Think of me." He turned away. He threw himself on his face on the sofa. "Oh, Jane, my hope, my love, my life," broke in anguish from his lips. Then came a deep, strong sob. I had already gained the door, but reader, I walked back as determinedly as I had retreated. I knelt by him. I turned his face from the cushion to me. I kissed his cheek. I smoothed his hair with my hand. "God bless you, my dear master," I said. "God keep you from harm and wrong, direct you, solace you, reward you well for your past kindness to me." "Little Jane's love would have been my best reward," he answered. "Without it my heart is broken. But Jane will give me her love, yes, nobly, generously." Up the blood rushed to his face, forth flashed the fire from his eyes, erect he sprang, he held his open arm. Up the blood rushed to his face, forth flashed the fire from his eyes, erect he sprang, he held his arms out, but I evaded the embrace and at once quitted the room. Farewell, was the cry of my heart as I left him. Despair added, farewell forever. Jane Eyre, Chapter 27. Welcome back to Professing Literature. We don't know where you're listening, but this is Oklahoma City on the first day of summer in the year of grace 2022. Professing Literature is the podcast where we look closely at short passages of important works of literature in the hopes of seeing writers in action. We aim to work across literary genres and modes, comedy and tragedy, drama, poetry, and fiction, looking at the dynamics of a passage in order to understand what the author is doing and what is at stake for the work as a whole, the issues that it clarifies, the techniques involved. I'm David Anderson, professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Oklahoma, and I am joined by my producer, Mr. Eric Williams. How are you, Eric?
Doing great, David. How are you today?
I'm pretty well, thank you. Happy to sit down and to talk and to get into this marvelous novel. I'm a little bit exhausted. I just now did the reading for the intro passage from chapter 27, which I think took me less than an hour to get it out. But it was quite a train ride, barreling through a mountain reading that passage. So.
Well, you did a great job.
Well, thank you. Hopefully I'm not too ditzy and dopey after that. But we are talking today about Charlotte Bronte and her most famous work of literature. I came here, Eric, to chew bubblegum and talk about Jane Eyre, and I am fresh out of bubblegum, so let's get into it. This is one of the most beloved novels in English literature, one of the greatest works of love literature in European history. Many of you, I'm sure, who are listening to me have probably read it. Some of you have probably read it many times, and it bears rereading. So we're talking about Jane Eyre, a book published in 1847, and the author's name on the title page was the name Currer Bell. Currer Bell. Currer Bell, it was soon after discovered, was a pseudonym for a young lady from the desolate moorlands of Yorkshire's West Riding. Charlotte Bronte was her real name. Charlotte was born to a family of precocious literary geniuses. Her sisters, Emily and Anne, were also the publishers of major works of fiction, and of course, Emily's only novel, Wuthering Heights, is one of those few books that can rival Jane Eyre and a handful of other titles as competitors for the greatest English novel. The family, it's a very sad story, the Bronte family. They were beset by tragedy. Charlotte's father, Patrick, outlived not only his wife, but all 5 of his daughters and his only son, Bramwell, dying after all of them had predeceased them. Charlotte was 31 years old when Jane Eyre was published to immediate acclaim. It tells the story, if you don't know it, of a small, friendless, plain-looking girl. She's raised by cruel, uncaring relatives after her parents die in her infancy of typhus. Eventually, this cruel family, the Reed family, who make her life very painful, send her off to a boarding school, to Lowood School, which is not much of an upgrade. The school is marked by harsh conditions and by fire and brimstone morality on the part of the master. The good thing about Lowood School is that Jane finds her first true friend there, a little girl named Helen Burns. And the relationship is a very important one that shapes Jane's understanding of herself and the world over the remainder of the novel. Helen is someone who encourages Jane to step back from the fiery oppositional character that is natural to her and to think in terms of mercy and duty and gratitude. Jane is fierce and cares passionately about justice and injustice. And it's not like these are bad things that need to be taken out of her character, but Helen helps her qualify them. Helen, however, dies of consumption in Jane's arms during an outbreak of illness at the school. Because of this outbreak, the dreadful conditions of the school are exposed, and the headmaster is exposed, and the school is reformed, and conditions improve, and Jane eventually becomes a teacher. However, while she's still a young woman, she decides to leave the school and to become a governess. In other words, a woman who oversees the bringing up and the education of the children of the sort of family that can afford to pay her wages. And so she advertises her ability to be a governess, and she's eventually offered a position at a place called Thornfield Hall in Yorkshire. She accepts the position. Thornfield Hall is a great house, one of the manor houses that England is famous for. It's an old house full of long corridors and Gothic touches. It's full of deep shadows, winding passages, and laughter, the echoing sound of strange laughter that comes from above and that is not satisfactorily explained to Jane. Jane's job at Thornfield involves the care and education of a little French girl named Adele, who has a mysterious benefactor, the owner of Thornfield, who spends most of his time away from the house. Several months go by before Jane meets this man, whose name is Mr. Rochester, Edward Rochester. And when she meets him, she finds him strange and compelling. But both discover that they have a sort of close sympathy for one another. Both are strong personalities. Mr. Rochester is a passionate and unpredictable man, a man of power, a man of enormous will, of great appetites, and who has a mysterious past. They fall in love, and they are to be married. This is supposed to be the happily ever after moment of the story. However, on the day of the wedding, and in a passage of great dramatic force, a horrible discovery is brought to light. Mr. Rochester is already married, and of course, that means he can't be married again. This is an era when you need an act of parliament to be divorced in England, and he's not getting that. And so he had hidden from Jane and from most of the world the fact that he had a wife named Bertha, whom his family had foisted on him when he was a young man, wanting the money that came with an alliance to her family, knowing very well that she was deeply psychologically disordered. And so Mr. Rochester had married this young woman and then found out that she was mad. He had done his duty by her in terms of taking care of her. That meant putting her at Thornfield Hall in the upper attic of the great house with an attendant, a woman named Grace Poole, who would look after her. He made sure that she was properly fed and clothed, but that was about it. And then he had spent the rest of his life trying to run away from the awareness that he had this wife. He did not expect to fall in love, And when he did fall in love with Jane, he couldn't tell her of the secret. She had started early on to suspect that something was wrong with the house, and that suspicion had mounted and mounted thanks to several dramatic moments. But it's not until the wedding that she discovers the true story. She decides that she has to leave Mr. Rochester immediately, cut ties completely. And she does this. And I'll just say for now that it's not the end of their story, but you'll have to read the book to get the details. The passage we're going to look at today closely comes from their first meeting. Jane has, as I said, been at Thornfield for several months. She did not know what to expect when she arrived. She could have walked in the door and found a pretty nasty situation. She might have walked in the front door and discovered great luxury and a lot of people and a lot of laughter. Instead, she had found an extremely quiet, remote place with very few fellow servants working there and with one little girl that she has to care for. But she has enjoyed it. Jane has had a painful life, and the quiet of Thornfield Hall suits her. She likes the other servants. She likes the little girl. And we find her one day in the late afternoon in winter walking to the post office to deliver a letter. So this is the passage that I'll read now that comes from chapter 12, her first meeting with Mr. Rochester. I'll just mention before I begin that the little village that Jane is walking to, where she's going to post her letter, is called Hay, just in case there's any confusion about that word cropping up. On the hilltop above me sat the rising moon. Pale yet as a cloud, but brightening momentarily, she looked over Hay, which, half lost in trees, sent up a blue smoke from its few chimneys. It was yet a mile distant, but in the absolute hush I could hear plainly its thin murmurs of life. My ear, too, felt the flow of currents. In what dales and depths I could not tell, but there were many hills beyond Hay, and doubtless many becks threading their passes. That evening calm betrayed alike the tinkle of the nearest streams, the saw of the most remote. A rude noise broke on these fine ripplings and whisperings, at once so far away and so clear. A positive tramp, tramp, a metallic clatter which effaced the soft wave wanderings, as in a picture the solid mass of a crag or the rough boles of a great oak, drawn in dark and strong on the foreground, efface the aerial distance of azure hill, sunny horizon, and blended clouds where tint melts into tint. The din was on the causeway. A horse was coming. The windings of the lane yet hid it, but it approached. I was just leaving the stile, yet as the path was narrow, I sat still to let it go by. In those days I was young, and all sorts of fancies, bright and dark, tenanted my mind. The memories of nursery stories were there amongst other rubbish, and when they recurred, maturing youth added to them a vigor and vividness beyond what childhood could give. As this horse approached, and as I watched for it to appear through the dusk, I remembered certain of Bessie's tales wherein a figure of north of England, a spirit called a Gytrash, which in the form of horse, mule, or large dog haunted solitary ways and sometimes came upon belated travellers, as this horse was now coming upon me. It was very near, but not yet in sight, when in addition to the tramp-tramp I heard a rush under the hedge, and close down by the hazel stems glided a great dog, whose black and white colour made him a distinct object against the trees. It was exactly one form of Bessie's Gytrash, a lion-like creature with long hair and a huge head. It passed me, however, quietly enough, not staying to look up, with strange pretercanine eyes in my face as I half expected it would. The horse followed, a tall steed, and on its back a rider. The man, the human being, broke the spell at once. Nothing ever rode the guy trash, it was always alone. And goblins, to my notions, though they may tenant the dumb carcasses of beasts, could scarce covet shelter in the commonplace human form. No guy trash was this, only a traveller, taking the short-cut to Millcote. He passed, and I went on a few steps, and I turned, a sliding sound and an exclamation of, "What the deuce is to do now?" and a clattering tumble arrested my attention. Man and horse were down. They had slipped on the sheet of ice which glazed the causeway. The dog came bounding back, and seeing his master in a predicament and hearing the horse groan, barked till the evening hills echoed the sound, which was in deep proportion to his magnitude. He snuffed round the prostrate group, and then ran up to me. It was all he could do. There was no other help at hand to summon. I obeyed him, and walked down to the traveller, by this time struggling to free himself of his steed. His efforts were so vigorous I thought he could not be much hurt, but I asked him the question, "Are you injured, sir?" I think he was swearing, but I am not certain. However, he was pronouncing some formula which prevented him from replying to me directly. "Can I do anything?" I asked again. "You must just stand on one side," he answered as he rose, first to his knees and then to his feet. I did, whereupon began a heaving, stamping, clattering process, accompanied by a barking and baying which removed me effectually some yards' distance. But I would not be driven quite away till I saw the event. This was finally fortunate. The horse was re-established, and the dog was silenced with a "Down, pilot!" The traveller now, stooping, felt his foot and leg as if trying whether they were sound. Apparently something ailed them, for he halted to the stile whence I had just risen, and sat down. I was in the mood for being useful, or at least officious, I think, for I now drew near him again. "If you are hurt and want help, sir, I can fetch someone either from Thornfield Hall or from Hay." "Thank you, I shall do. I have no broken bones, only a sprain." And again he stood up and tried his foot, but the result extorted an involuntary "Ugh!" Something of daylight still lingered, and the moon was waxing bright. I could see him plainly. His figure was enveloped in a riding cloak, fur-collared and steel-clasped. Its details were not apparent, but I traced the general points of middle height and considerable breadth of chest. He had a dark face with stern features and a heavy brow. His eyes and gathered eyebrows looked ireful and thwarted just now. He was past youth, but had not reached middle age. Perhaps he might be 35. I felt no fear of him, and but little shyness. Had he been a handsome, heroic-looking young gentleman, I should not have dared to stand thus questioning him against his will, and offering my services unasked. I had hardly ever seen a handsome youth, never in my life spoken to one. I had a theoretical reverence and homage for beauty, elegance, gallantry, fascination, but had I met those qualities incarnate in masculine shape, I should have known instinctively that they neither had nor could have sympathy with anything in me, and should have shunned them as one would fire, lightning, or anything else that is bright but antipathetic. If even this stranger had smiled and been good-humoured to me when I addressed him, if he had put off my offer of assistance gaily and with thanks, I should have gone on my way and not felt any vocation to renew inquiries. But the frown, the roughness of the traveller set me at ease. I retained my station when he waved me to go, and announced, "I cannot think of leaving you, sir, at so late an hour in this solitary lane till I see you are fit to mount your horse." He looked at me when I said this. He had hardly turned his eyes in my direction before. "I should think you ought to be at home yourself," said he, "if you have a home in this neighbourhood. Where do you come from?" "From just below, and I am not at all afraid of being out late when it is moonlight. I will run over to Hay for you with pleasure if you wish. Indeed, I am going there to post a letter." "You live just below. Do you mean that house with the battlements?" pointing to Thornfield Hall, on which the moon cast a hoary gleam, bringing it out distinct and pale from the woods that, by contrast with the western sky, now seemed one mass of shadow. "Yes, sir." "Whose house is it?" "Mr. Rochester's." "Do you know Mr. Rochester?" "No, I have never seen him." "He is not resident, then?" No. Can you tell me where he is? I cannot. You are not a servant at the hall, of course. You are... He stopped, ran his eyes over my dress, which as usual was quite simple. A black merino cloak, a black beaver bonnet, neither of them half fine enough for a lady's maid. He seemed puzzled to decide what I was. I helped him. I am the governess. Ah, the governess, he repeated. Deuce take me if I had not forgotten the governess. And again my raiment underwent scrutiny. In 2 minutes he rose from the stile. His face expressed pain when he tried to move. I cannot commission you to fetch help, he said, but you may help me a little yourself if you will be so kind. Yes, sir. You have not an umbrella I can use as a stick? No. Try to get hold of my horse's bridle and lead him to me. You are not afraid? I should have been afraid to touch a horse when alone, but when told to do it I was disposed to obey. I put down my muff on the stile and went up to the tall steed. I endeavoured to catch the bridle, but it was a spirited thing and would not let me come near its head. I made an effort, though in vain. Meantime I was mortally afraid of its tramping 4 feet. The traveller waited and watched for some time, and at last he laughed. I see, he said. The mountain will never be brought to Mahomet, so all you can do is to aid Mahomet to go to the mountain. I must beg of you to come here. I came. Excuse me, he continued. Necessity compels me to make you useful. He laid a heavy hand on my shoulder and, leaning on me with some stress, limped to his horse. Having once caught the bridle, he mastered it directly and sprang to his saddle, grimacing grimly as he made the effort, for it wrenched his sprain. Now, he said, releasing his underlip from a hard bite, just hand me my whip. It lies there under the hedge. I sought it and found it. Thank you. Now make haste with the letter to Hay and return as fast as you can. A touch of a spurred heel made his horse first start and rear and then bound away. The dog rushed in his traces. All 3 vanished. Like heath that in the wilderness the wild wind whirls away. I took up my muff and walked on. The incident had occurred and it was gone for me. It was an incident of no moment, no romance, no interest in any sense, yet marked with change 1 single hour of a monotonous life. My help had been needed and claimed. I had given it. I was pleased to have done something, trivial, transitory though the deed was. It was yet an active thing, and I was weary of an existence all passive. The new face, too, was like a picture introduced to the gallery of memory, and it was dissimilar to all others hanging there. Firstly, because it was masculine, and secondly, because it was dark, strong, and stern. I had it still before me when I entered Hay and slipped the letter into the post office. I saw it as I walked fast downhill all the way home. When I came to the stile, I stopped a minute, looked round and listened with an idea that a horse's hoofs might ring on the causeway again, and that a rider in a cloak and a Gytrash-like Newfoundland dog might be again apparent. I saw only the hedge, and a pollard willow before me rising up still and straight to meet the moonbeams. I heard only the faintest waft of wind roaming fitful among the trees round Thornfield a mile distant, and when I glanced down in the direction of the murmur, my eye, traversing the hall front, caught a light kindling in a window, reminding me that I was late, and hurried on. So, this is the meeting of Jane and Mr. Rochester. We begin with Bronte has a very sharp ability to sketch the situation, the setting, I should say, with some bold, definite lines. We have the place and the time of day. The place is a little roadway that goes from Thornfield Hall to this tiny village. And so there is drama inherent in the idea of the road. Jane is moving somewhere. Mr. Rochester himself is moving in the opposite direction, and they meet. They come together in this roadway. There's something there of cross purposes, perhaps, but Jane will find out that both of them call the same place home, Thornfield Hall. She uses that word towards the end of the passage to describe the hall. She doesn't know that he is the master of Thornfield. She'll find out soon enough as he lies on the couch nursing his sprained ankle when she comes in. But she eventually is going in the same direction at him. But first there is this meeting and the suggestion of these two lives on sort of trajectories, opposite trajectories. And for what all the world would think they are on opposite trajectories. She is a humble governess. He is a man of status and eminence and wealth. She should be nothing more to him than one of his employees. She's going to be much more than that. So they seem to be on opposite trajectories, but eventually they'll both be gathered up in that great house together. So they're on this road. Beside the road is a stile. A stile is a sort of built-in stone staircase that can lead over a wall or over a hedge, in this case probably a hedge. And Jane is sitting there, resting, while she hears the horse approaching. The scene is, as I said, late in the afternoon. In England in the winter, it probably doesn't need to be very late in the afternoon for the sky to be rapidly darkening and for the moon to be getting brighter and brighter. This scene it's a moonlit meeting. The moon shining down is suggestive, perhaps, of the uncanny, of the otherworldly. There's a different feel to a first meeting that occurs in moonlight, in contrast to one that occurs in the sunshine. Jane mentions the moon both at the beginning of the passage and at the end of the passage. And the moon is suggestive, as I say, of something uncanny and otherworldly about this meeting. It lends the scene an atmosphere of the mysterious and even of the supernatural. And Bronte is an artist with this atmosphere, with this kind of atmosphere. She can create in us the feeling of a situation that is mysterious and that is even sinister. And yet I would say she does so only to deflate that idea. Bronte is writing in a culture where for decades the Gothic has been one of the major subgenres of fiction. Gothic fiction, as the name implies, and we have sort of Gothic revivals. We've had Gothic revivals ever since, and there's plenty of Gothic imagery in our own culture, whether it's movies or TV or novels or whatever, but the Gothic is mysterious. The Gothic is a sort of place of heightened experience, of the strange, of the supernatural, of deep shadows, of old crumbling ruins, of spooky things that happen, of people with passionate desires and great rages and dark pasts that they don't want to talk about. Bronte deploys this imagery all the time, but she always does so in a way that runs counter to the sort of substance of the Gothic. Jane refuses to allow herself to believe that she is in a Gothic story. And she's not. She's not in a Gothic story. Jane Eyre is not about spirits walking in the night. It's not about the supernatural. It's about real people who have to struggle with real problems. And so she can feel the weight of this imagery as it crowds on her. But she's too keen-eyed, and she's too confident in her own sense of what is true to be swept away by it. And that's a kind of important aspect of her character, and it will be a vital aspect of her relationship with Mr. Rochester. In the first paragraph I read just now, she talks about hearing from her position on this stile on this very still evening, what she calls the flow of currents, of sounds, of whispers of streams running between hills, of wind sighing, or as she says, sawing in the trees. The world seems to be whispering to her and suggesting things. And there is indeed a theme in this book about secrets, and about one big secret in particular that she is tantalized by. But she's never captivated by these things. I'm not sure if the distinction I'm making makes sense. Hopefully it does. But there is a theme in the book of what can be heard, what can be understood, what can be gleaned from the world around Jane. But her disposition is always to stand where the ground is firm and to look for the real and not to get caught up. Jane Eyre is not someone who thinks she's a character in a Gothic novel. She hears a sharper noise as she's sitting resting, and it's the noise of horse hooves. And she's trying to discern it. Again, discernment is an important idea in this book. She's trying to discern what it is as she sits there. Of course, it's a horse coming down, which is a commonplace thing in 19th century England, even if it's not that common in this little traveled part of northern England. But a horse is coming, and so there's further mystery. Who's on this horse? Might just be a farmer riding home, but it might be more than that. And so she sits there to let the horse pass by, and she talks about how ideas and suggestions and whisperings assail her mind in this moment, because, of course, if you are the star of a Gothic novel, this would be a key moment for you. But she doesn't let herself rest in those things, and indeed she calls it rubbish, these ideas that she received from reading in childhood, these things that she says tenant her mind. And that word tenant is an interesting one. The idea that ideas don't merely occur to her or that she has learned them, but they are tenanted in her mind. And of course, Thornfield Hall is a house with a very particular tenant. The idea of the mad woman up there in the attic fits very nicely within this picture of things that Jane is sketching, but she doesn't give in to them. She does recall that her old nurse used to tell her about a folk tale from northern England, and she's in northern England right now, of the Gytrash. This is a spirit that would take the shape of various animals, most commonly a big dog. It would be threatening to travelers. Sometimes in these tales, as I understand it, it could be helpful or benign towards them, but not necessarily. And it's a spooky thing. She is not going to give in to this idea, though. So she disdains these fanciful ideas. Jane Eyre is a character who works harder than most of us do to discern what is true and to live according to the best and sharpest sense that she can come to of what is true. There is a mysterious creature in this novel. She has already heard it laughing in the rooms above her own at Thornfield Hall. But the tenant that haunts Thornfield Hall is not a spirit, it's not a ghost, it's a real person, although regrettably a person who has gone insane. Bertha is not a nothing the way the Gytrash is. But the real issue in the novel is not the negotiation of the spiritual world or ghosts or anything like that. The problems that Jane has to confront in this novel have to do with the human heart and what it wants and what it needs, and where it will take someone who isn't prepared to subject it to higher realities. Rochester himself, throughout their relationship, will always be talking about Jane in terms of the fairy world. He refers to her as a kind of sprite or fairy or pixie, someone otherworldly. He talks about how she sort of appears to him out of the mist on this night, as he recounts later on their first meeting. And for the rest of their relationship, at least the first phase of their relationship, he will link her to this kind of language and these sorts of associations, that she's someone otherworldly. She resists this and does not like it when he figures her in this way, when he talks about her being a fairy. And she tells him at one point, in one key passage that we're not looking at today, that she's real, that she's a real person with real feelings. And so we have this theme of the real versus the fantastic. Throughout the novel, Jane will seem to have possibilities dangled before her that haunt her with the idea of fantasy. There's a key scene with a fortune teller earlier in the novel who is not who she appears to be. She has the chance at one point to marry a man who, from a certain perspective, is too good to be true. And then there is the first wedding with Mr. Rochester, which falls apart because it was too good to be true. So what is real in this world of mists and lingering shades, where one color melts into another, where sounds whisper to us in the background, and where something is coming up the road that our imagination wants to tell us might be a guy trash? What is real? And what is the basis in this world where the real is hard to discern for our choices? So, the sound, the tramp, tramp of the horse's hooves comes closer and closer. And, this young woman, she's hard to shake, because she's been thinking about this legend of the guy trash and dismissing it from her mind, when what should burst out of the undergrowth but this great big black and white dog. And so she says it's just like a guy trash. And it's a huge big dog, and Newfoundland is a big dog, but it's a friendly enough animal, and it goes right by her. And so there's this sense of deflation of, it's just a dog, and it's a dog that's not even interested in me. It turns out to be benign. The next thing that happens is the horse passes by. And this is our first look at Mr. Rochester. And I love this encounter in the way Bronte develops it, because it is a beautiful combination of Mr. Rochester, the romantic hero, deflated. I've already used that word to describe the way Austen handles the Gothic themes. And she's doing the same thing with Mr. Rochester. Now, Mr. Rochester at arm's length looks like he's a classic example of what we think of as the Byronic hero. Lord Byron was one of the most admired poets of the early 19th century in England, the Romantic era, and he lived in a way that was larger than life. He was a bad boy. He wrote brilliant, often very funny, often very powerful and compelling poetry, and his life was scandal-plagued and scandal-ridden. He slept with innumerable women. He was very handsome. He was always in trouble. Eventually, he died trying to do his part in the war for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire, so he died this romantic death. And he created this idea of the Byronic hero in poems like Childe Harold, the idea of the hero who is not a Sir Galahad, who is not a sort of classic white knight. The Byronic hero is a mixture of the dark and the light. He's not terribly trustworthy. He is a little bit menacing. He's a man of passion, often of overwhelming passion. His heart is capable of goodness, of generosity, but not necessarily always of decency. He's pursuing great objects with absolute intensity and he's not that interested in the rules of society. And so the Byronic hero has a long legacy, a lineage that goes right up into our own day. You know, you can think of Batman as a Byronic hero. There's something, you know, he's fighting for justice, but he's fighting for justice because he's aggrieved, because he's nursing this sort of old pain, this anger at the criminals that had killed his parents, and he does his fighting in darkness and in the shadows. And people wonder, is he good? Is he on our side? Can we trust him? He's removed and remote. His emotions are kept from us. And so Rochester, another example, just as famous as Rochester, maybe the greatest Byronic hero of the 19th century, is given to us by Charlotte Bronte's sister Emily, and that's Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is this angry man, handsome. Like Rochester, he's dark-favored. In other words, his hair is black, and his skin is not the sort of lily-white skin of the typical aristocrat. He's powerful, he's compelling, he's good at getting what he wants, he's good at controlling people. He is wildly, passionately in love with Cathy, whom he can't have. He's angry, and he's not afraid by typical moral platitudes that would keep him from seeking revenge against those who have hurt him. Rochester, from 10 feet away, seems to fit this pattern. He's there on his great horse. He's an accomplished rider. He's wearing this sort of black cloak. You know, think how romantic the silhouette is already. He's got these intense eyes. We're told that Rochester is not a handsome man, just as Jane Eyre is not a conventionally attractive woman. He's not a handsome man, but he is, we see at various points in the novel, he is a man that women are attracted to because of his burning intensity. And so when he first appears before Jane, she is taking it all in. And we've got this rider on the horse, and it's very impressive. They pass each other, and then immediately he wipes out. The horse stumbles and goes down. That's a dangerous thing. The horse can land on top of you. You can be in very bad trouble. And so she hears him go down. So the Byronic hero falls. That's the first thing we see him do. This does not make Mr. Rochester a ridiculous figure. It makes him a human figure. He's got bigger falls than this to come in the future. And they aren't bad. They shake the image of him as the controlling man of power and undermine it. But that's a good thing. Because there's something better for him than to be the controlling man of power. And that is to be happy. And in order for him to be happy, he's going to have to let go of the image of himself as commanding and powerful. It's going to be taken away from him, whether he wants to lose it or not. Well, he doesn't especially want to lose it. But down he goes. He slips on the ice. There's imagery all through this novel of fire. Jane herself is often described in terms of fiery language, and she uses fiery language often to describe situations around her. It's all through the novel. And there are a couple of key scenes in the novel that involve fire as major points in the story. Right now, though, we have ice. We have two characters who are cold on a winter evening, and Mr. Rochester's horse slipping on the ice. And there's something interesting about this. I might be stretching too far, but Mr. Rochester is locked in the ice at this point in his story. His heart is numb and icy because of the grievances that he's nursing, and Jane is going to thaw it. Anyway, poor Mr. Rochester is down with a sprained ankle. It would not be fun at any point to sprain your ankle. Right now, though, it's not just pain, but embarrassment he's got to deal with, although he doesn't especially seem to be bothered. He pulls himself up And the first question Jane asks him, the first words they speak to one another, are Jane asking him, "Are you injured, sir?" One of an innocuous question, quite a natural question to ask, but a thematically interesting question. Yes, he sure as hell is injured. Right now, it's with a sprained ankle, but there is a deeper injury. She's asking, Jane is someone who probes, and she especially probes him. He's sitting on the ground swearing, not very bothered that there's a lady standing there who, according to the typical rules, he shouldn't be swearing in the presence of. He doesn't treat her with courtesy. He doesn't treat her gallantly. He will use her, we see, to help mount the horse again. And he will talk to her. He will interrogate her briefly. But he doesn't offer her anything courtly. He doesn't laugh off his injuries and say, "Oh, no, it's nothing." He uses her help to get back on the horse, and he talks to her sort of briskly. And all of this Jane seems to receive as a compliment. She doesn't know anything about young men. She was raised in a school. She spent her teens in a school for girls, and then she came to this house. She tells us she doesn't know anything about young men and has never talked to a sort of handsome, fashionable young man in her life. But his crustiness is interesting to her and even appealing to her. It's paying her the compliment, you could say, of taking her seriously. Then instead of saying, no, I'll limp around and catch my own horse as best I can and mount up. I wouldn't want to bother you, and toss off a couple of compliments about how you're too elegant a young lady to do that. Jane wouldn't believe that anyway. She doesn't think of herself that way, and no one else does really anyway. He addresses her frankly, with curiosity as to who she is, and she takes her help. You know, a gentleman is supposed to offer help to the lady, but here we are at the very beginning of this relationship with the lady offering pretty vital aid to the gentleman, and he's happy enough to accept it. So we begin this relationship with Mr. Rochester falling and with Jane helping him, and this is going to initiate a pattern that will run through to the end of the novel. So she is not, Jane is one of the words that's used to describe Jane throughout the novel is, there are a few of them. One of them is plain. It's often stressed that she's nothing special to look at. Another one is small. She's not tall and strong, even by female standards. She's strong enough to help him, and she's stronger right now than he realizes. So he makes use of her, and she takes a longer look at him, appreciates his appearance without falling in love with him or anything like that, but she's fascinated by him. She says, "The frown, the roughness of the traveler set me at my ease." And so she stays there, continuing to offer him help. And they begin this conversation, this question and answer. Through this questioning and answering, he, of course, is playing with her. Because when he gleans that she is from Thornfield Hall, which is his house, and when he eventually ascertains that she's the governess that he hired, he required one of his servants to hire a governess for his ward, and this happens, and so he knew this happens, but it hadn't been on his mind. He's like, oh, the governess. He's playing with her. Because he could simply say, "I'm your employer, I'm Mr. Rochester, thanks for the hand." But he plays with her, he asks her questions, and then he rides away. He is not especially thankful. He's polite enough, but he will ride away without saying much. Now, in all this, we don't see Jane. We see Jane acting according to her capacities. She's never ridden a horse before. As a young woman in this culture, she would have certainly been in carriages or wagons, pulled by horses. But she's unfamiliar with horses and rather nervous of them. She doesn't quite know what she's doing with his horse. In the end, all she can do is sort of support him while he catches the horse's bridle and brings it under control, because he knows what he's doing, and mounts it. Jane says that the horse was a spirited thing, and those of you who know horses will know that there's a big difference between a horse that is spirited and a horse that is docile. Rochester's horse, as befits a gentleman, a rather dashing gentleman, is spirited, and he grabs it and calms it and mounts it, thanks to being able to lean on Jane's arm. He will assume he loves the spirit in Jane. It's one of the best things about Mr. Rochester is that he is attracted to Jane's spirit, to her fieriness. He doesn't want her to be docile, but he does want to control her. And historically, in Western culture, the image of the mounted rider is an image of control, of power. So if you go to some piazza in Italy or, Westminster in London or something like that, every once in a while you'll see an equestrian statue. That is a king or a politician or a general or someone like that mounted on a horse in the statue. And this goes back to the Roman Empire, where certain statues of emperors would be equestrian, would show the emperor mounted. And it's not just because people like horses or because it lets you make an even bigger statue than you would have if he was just standing there on his own two legs. It's a way of suggesting that this person who is depicted is a person of authority and control, because he can ride, he can steer, he can direct this 1,200 pounds of muscle underneath him that he's riding on. And so this is an image we have of Mr. Rochester. We see him wipe out and lose control. Now he's back on the horse. He controls this powerful horse and mounts it. He will not control Jane this way. At various times, he seems to think of her as this hot-blooded filly whose spirit he finds attractive, but he's going to get her where he wants her. He genuinely loves her. I would say that the love Jane and Rochester have for one another is genuine, but Mr. Rochester thinks he will control Jane. And it's not that Jane is especially independent-minded, but Jane is deeply moral, and there are lines she will not cross, even for Mr. Rochester as passionately, and there are lines she will not cross, even for Mr. Rochester as passionately as she loves him. He will not be able to handle her the way he handles this horse. But for now, we've seen him both slip and fall and make a bit of a fool of himself, and then regain himself and regain this horse, and off he rides into the night. But what we really are told in this encounter is that Jane is the strong one. It's not that Mr. Rochester is a weak man, but Jane is the strong one. Jane is this physically small person without any money in her pockets, without any beauty to trade on in the marriage market, with enough education to be useful, but not enough education to be important, and yet she is strong. He says, in the passage we began the episode with, when they're about to part, Mr. Rochester grabs her like a savage Byronic lover, full of passion, wanting to say, "No, you're not leaving me. I will control you. I will grab your bridle. I will be in command." And even as he grabs her, he says that I can't remember exactly the words I read, but that she's as slender as a reed, but he realizes she is like a reed that is made out of steel. She is too strong for him. Jane's backbone could support the weight of the London Monument. And so he can sort of pose as the commanding man of power, getting back on the horse, but it's only because he's able to lean on the shoulder of this ostensibly frail, tiny, petite woman. And so she helps him mount up again. He mounts up, and their last words are him telling her, be on your way and get back quickly, as though he's already sort of talking to her as a boss. And off he goes into the night with the dog following. And it looks pretty impressive, and Jane recites this little snatch of contemporary poetry. I can't remember who it's by. I looked the author up. I think it's Moore, someone who was fairly well known in the first half of the 19th century, but has since been forgotten. Like heath that in the wilderness the wild wind whirls away. So that's what it's like, she thinks, when he rides off. So she gives him his sort of due as a romantic Gothic Byronic hero riding off into the night, although the emphasis is on the wild wind that whirls him away, which is not a bad way of describing the sort of sense of confusion she has as he slips out of sight up the road, and she's left wondering who exactly he is. And also the sense of the wind of passion, right? In the second circle of hell in Dante's Inferno, the circle of the lustful. Dante and Virgil come and they see the souls of the lustful forever damned to be whirled about in a great whirlwind. And this is emblematic of the fact that in their lives the lustful had given in to the storm of passion. And so their eternal fate is to be whirled round and round and round. Again, Jane will not be whirled around that way. When she discovers the secret and when everything in her wants to comfort Mr. Rochester and be with Mr. Rochester, knowing that any pretense that she could just be there as a friend with him would completely fall apart. She doesn't want to be his friend. She wants to be his lover, his wife. She refuses to enter that whirlwind, and instead makes the much harder choice to disappear from his life, not assuming that she'll ever see him again, not assuming that he'll ever be able to be hers. Off he goes, whirling away. She can say easily enough in the last paragraph I read that the incident didn't really matter, that there was no romance in it. I'm not sure about that. But it is romance that she more or less effectively deflates. And she is not used to thinking of herself as the kind of girl that a strange man would take a sudden attraction to. But she does acknowledge that this is what she calls an essential hour. Or she doesn't say that. She says, it marked with change one single hour of a monotonous life. This is a key moment in her life. Off she goes to post her letter, thinking about this face she saw, this face that is not like other faces, both because it's the face of an adult man, and she's not used to very many of those, at least that aren't very much of the working class servants. It's a face that is filled with fire and with passion and intensity, that's not especially handsome, but it is, she says, dark, strong, and stern. And she says, I had it still before me when I entered Hay and slipped the letter into the post office. And she said she saw the face as she walked home. She'll never stop thinking of this man for the rest of her life. And this is the moment when they first meet. So off she goes, stressing the trees and the moon and the road, all of these elements that she was stressing at the beginning of the passage as she walks home. So we end where we began with the same elements involved, but something has been changed at this point. So I'm looking at the clock, and I've been talking for a long time already, and it's funny how these podcast episodes seem to get longer and longer every time, or more or less. So I'm not going to say a lot about the opening passage. It took a long time to read, but I'm not going to hammer on it too much. It's an extraordinary moment when they part, both of them thinking, assuming that it's forever. in some ways, it kind of pays off some of the issues that were raised in that first meeting. Bronte is an exacting artist. She's doing things deliberately, not by accident. And so there are themes which are raised in that initial meeting that are deepened or played with here in the final parting, or not final parting, but what seems to be the final parting. So Jane says goodbye to Mr. Rochester, and it breaks both of their hearts. They're in love with each other. She says, as I read, that she could never ask to be better loved than he loves her. She really believes in and trusts his love. That is never in question. And that she loves him just as much, or she thinks even more than he does. So the love is not in question, but the relationship can't go. Jane is not going to live as either his fake wife or as his mistress. He tells her, you don't have any family that would be outraged, or even really any friends. No one's going to be gossiping about you. If you're my mistress, socially speaking, you'd have higher status as my mistress than you would probably any other way. So that's not an issue. But Jane doesn't care about that. She never did care about that. She's not going to live that way. And she's not going to live near him, given that they can't get married when it's all both of them want to. She knows that if she hangs around Thornfield Hall and just tries to be the governess again and his friend and talk to him in the evening and help him bear his burdens, that she's going to be his lover. So instead, telling him that she's going to bed and that they'll talk it over in the morning, she disappears. And so they both assume they'll never see each other again. Mr. Rochester in this final scene pulls out all the stops, trying to convince Jane to stay. You'll be saving my life. You'll be saving my soul. Yes, I was married, but I wasn't really married. I wasn't married to a person, he says, but to a hideous demon. Now, it makes us wince a little bit the way he sometimes talks about this woman, his first wife. We would prefer greater sensitivity, I suppose, when the subject is someone who's profoundly mentally ill. Mr. Rochester suggests that his first wife is not just mentally ill, but mentally ill in a way that makes her sort of dangerous and depraved, that her family had known about this, and that even his family had known about it, and yet allowed her marriage to the young and naive Mr. Rochester anyway, had sort of sacrificed him on behalf of the family's bottom line. And so all of this is not his fault, he wants to say. It's not his fault. Jane Eyre could tell him, although she doesn't say it in so many words, that one of the hard facts of life is that something may not be your fault, but it can still be your responsibility. And Mrs. Rochester is Mr. Rochester's responsibility. And he's not getting married while she's still living. And so he calls her a hideous demon. And aside from the fact that that's a nasty way to talk about her, even though he's got reason to complain about the person he's married to, she's not a hideous demon. She's not a hideous demon any more than Jane Eyre is not a fairy or a sprite. And Jane, as I've said, always tries to base her action on the real. She wants to know what the truth is. And so we see her in this scene. You know, what's changed? There have been a dozen or so chapters that have passed between the first meeting with Mr. Rochester and this parting after the wedding. What's changed? Jane hasn't changed very much herself, if at all. What's changed is that she now knows this man. She knows his secret. We know it now. And part of that secret involves him being at war with himself. Mr. Rochester is a man of passion and anger. He's brilliant, he's funny, he's warm-hearted in his own way, but he's at war with himself, and Jane now knows why. And we see Jane at her weakest as her heart is breaking, but also at her strongest, because she won't give in to the fact that all she wants is right in front of her. She's strong enough not just to leave Mr. Rochester, but to bless him. And the way it's sketched is very powerful, because he kisses her, trying to get her to stay, and she breaks away from him. And they talk for a little while, and she makes clear that she's leaving. And he sort of says, "Oh, well, go then, you can go." He's utterly defeated at this point. But rather than just wheeling and going out the door, Jane doesn't do that. That would be the easier thing. Instead, she goes back to him and kisses him before they part. She leaves him and she blesses him. She says that she walked back as determinedly as she had retreated and knelt by him and kissed his face. And she says, "God bless you." She calls him dear master because she likes speaking of him that way. She likes referring to him as Mr. Rochester and as her master, even though they're about to be married and she's no longer the governess. She likes that way of talking, but it's perfectly clear here that if she's going to honor him with the title of master, it's not because he's in charge, and it's not because he determines her choices. She determines her choices, and she's going to base her choice, she says, on the law given by God and sanctioned by man. She says that she is insane in this moment, completely unreliable, and therefore the only firm thing she can find to stand on or to grab onto is the law of God. She says that, not in so many words, that she doesn't know which way is up, but she can grab onto that. And even though it means she has to make this choice that breaks her heart, it's solid, that you only get one spouse at a time. And until they die, you're stuck with them. And so Jane's strength is remarkable here. She has the strength of a giant on the sort of moral and emotional level in this tiny, overlooked package. She's strong enough not just to leave Mr. Rochester, but to affirm him. And she walks out the door. There's a theme in the second half of this book, at least, of divestment, of losing what you have or giving it away, allowing it to be taken from you so that you can have it given back to you. It's the paradox in the Gospels of Jesus that whoever shall lose his life will save it. Except a grain of wheat go into the ground and die, it will be unfruitful. But if it go into the ground, it will bring forth much fruit. That you have to let go of the things you want to hold on to. And Jane does that. She goes off into the countryside and has a kind of collapse and doesn't know anyone and has to rebuild her life from the ground up. Mr. Rochester, at least on the emotional level, has to do the same thing. And that process only really starts for him when he loses everything, or the everything he's known, in the form of Thornfield Hall. I won't get into how that happens in the novel. If you don't know it, you should dig into the book. The best thing happens in the end after all. But even if it hadn't happened, I think Bronte wants us to understand it would have been better. I'm like any other reader when I read this passage. The majority, the larger part of me just wants to say, oh, give in. It'll be okay. But from Bronte's point of view, it would not have been okay if they had lived the lie by living together. They would have killed their love. Separation, even if it had been forever, would have been better than a false marriage. If they had been married, if we're allowed to speculate, if they had been married while Bertha was still living, it would have killed their love. At the end of the novel, Jane describes their relationship as one of perfect concord, an absolute mental and emotional identification. And that would not have come to be if they had decided to maintain their relationship in the face of what Jane believes to be an absolute defeater. I've gone on too long at this point already, and I feel like I've left a bunch of hostages to fortune. Like there's too much in this, just these couple of passages to talk about than I've really been able to get my hands around. Anyway, if you want more Charlotte Bronte, send us a note. We are, of course, wide open to your ratings and reviewings and your subscriptions. And if you want to send us an email, the address is professingliterature@protonmail.com. It's in the show notes. So please get in touch if you'd like more Charlotte Bronte or more Emily Bronte or some Emily Bronte. There's certainly more in this novel, as there is in the Bronte sisters' corpus in general, to go into. So be happy to return to this text before too long. But at this point, I will just, on behalf of Eric Williams and myself, say thank you, and we will be back with you before too long.